Hello, hello. Welcome to AngularAir. We're missing Justin tonight, so I'm filling in, and I'm going to try and do it justice. This is a very exciting episode, and I'm going to introduce our guests. But first, I'm going to introduce our panelists. Say hello, Alyssa.
Hello, hello.
How are you? You have to show us this fingernail polish.
It's very autumn.
It's amazing. It's amazing, darling. Mike Brocky. How are you, Mike? How's your week going? Happy Friday.
Thank you. Week's going well. Happy Friday to you as well. And things are going swell. I have some bad news. My nails are not painted.
Oh, it's not too late, Mike. You could consider it for the future.
It's never too
I can
late.
see if I can get my daughters in here to paint my nails like a little off screen. Just, hey, hit them up. But yeah.
Yes, please. Yes. And everybody, if you want Mike's daughters to paint his nails, please let us know in the comments and we can make that happen.
Oh, man.
Okay.
Not where I saw this show going.
It's not. No, we're just going to ask them what they want. That's all. I'm sorry. Justin's never going to let me host again. Okay, so let's get into our guest. How are you, Nathan Walker and Alex Ziskind? NativeScript. How are you? Nathan, you want to say hi and tell us about Alex?
Thank you so much for having us. Yes, Alex is a long lost brother. Him and I have been working together for quite some time now. We happen to share a pretty exciting interest in NativeScript together, but we've also do client work together as well. So Alex is someone who does a lot of video streaming. If you've learned anything about NativeScript in the past couple of years, you might have learned it from Alex. He does great material on YouTube and just a really awesome guy to work with in general. And Alex, if you can top that for yourself, go ahead.
Oh, that is quite an intro. Thank you, Nathan. And Nathan and I have been doing some streams very recently, and they've been doing pretty well. And we've known each other for what, like 3 or 4 years now, ever since NativeScript has been around.
Maybe 4 years.
They've been around 5 years now. So yeah, it's been quite a journey. And Nathan, of course, is part of the core team of NativeScript, one of the founders of NStudio.
Well, yes.
Doing an amazing job.
You have to tell us about this because there was NStudio and then something happened with NativeScript and we haven't seen you in forever.
Wait.
Go. What, Mike?
You guys are talking about streaming. Where are you streaming? Where can people find you stream before we get into
Good question.
Great question.
Go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, so on the main NativeScript channel, you can just find that on YouTube, NativeScript. There's a main NativeScript channel where we post up weekly updates about NativeScript. And I also have a channel under Alexander Ziskind, where I do just random tutorials and we do live streams there as well.
Is that also on YouTube?
Yep, YouTube. They're both on YouTube.
Excellent. I can tell from your setup you're pretty professional over there. Okay, so you can find the Alexander Ziskind channel and the NativeScript channel on YouTube, but after the show, y'all, not now. Stay here with us now and then go check that out after the show.
Everyone's like,
okay. Bye. So Nathan, can you tell us about this NStudio NativeScript journey? What's been going on this year?
Yeah, so, open source software obviously is always an interesting place to work. I think anyone that works in and around open source, it's always, fascinating in a lot of ways. And I'd say if you develop with open source professionally, you're always kind of wondering, what could happen with this open source software that I'm using and what's behind it. So, NativeScript was obviously created, well, maybe not obviously for some of you that don't know about it, but it was created maybe 5-6 years ago by a company called Telerik, who is in Sofia, Bulgaria. And then they got acquired by Progress Software, who does Kendo. And if you're in the Angular community, you may have heard of Kendo before. But they hosted NativeScript for 3 years, maybe it was. And, they had an incredible group of engineers that were working behind it, really did a lot of the work to establish this kind of key advantage that NativeScript has, which is basically empowerment of the platform through JavaScript. It's a unique take in the space because most frameworks out there, there's only a handful, I'd say, but there's always different approaches on how to do this. NativeScript is really one that took the angle of putting JavaScript first and then trying to celebrate the platform through JavaScript. And so that's a rather unique approach. Probably the end of 2019, the community really wanted to drive the framework more and more. And so I think it made sense for all parties involved to allow NativeScript to be community driven. And there was a process of kind of making sure that could happen. And so our involvement kind of started maybe back around late 2019, early 2020, and kind of discussing how that could work and looking at a lot of other open source projects like Electron or even jQuery, even Node for that matter, establish a pretty nice, well-formulated open source governance guidelines, and so we established a technical steering committee to drive the framework solely by the community. So it's really not backed by corporate interests. It's purely something that is driven by community interests alone. And we currently probably have 9 people on the technical steering committee, and we probably will grow it to 21 members probably in the next couple months. Now, the technical steering committee, for those that maybe are not familiar with general open source guidelines in that sense, is really a group that meets on a regular basis to talk about technical aspects that surround that open source software, and generally do votes on where it should go, features that should be implemented, what should be addressed, and generally drive, as the name suggests, steer the open source in a direction that the community wants it to go.
Wow.
So, and to be clear, that's when you say a technical committee, those are developers or former developers, very technical people who are driving the technical platform, not so much anybody with like business or specifically with business acumen and no technical knowledge to drive things forward.
That's correct. Yeah, the technical steering committee is usually going to be technical by name, but it's not to exclude necessarily business people that could be involved in steering that as well. But that would be probably a separate committee, like a council that would probably oversee and work together with the technical steering committee, which probably will be established along with the TSC in the coming months.
That makes a lot of sense because you need to be able to provide direction for not just the technical goals of, hey, we want to do new things, we want to rewrite, we want to go forward and add new features and not clearing up technical debt or solidify things. So it's good to have a balance of visions there.
We luckily have a ton of business input in this framework. I guess they always have because there is a pretty impassioned community behind NativeScript, a lot of diverse viewpoints, really a very spirited community around that framework. But it all revolves down to JavaScript. I think ultimately what's the nice common chord with that, and I think it's likewise for Angular as well, is that it's really just a love for JavaScript.
That is awesome.
So
Have you found challenges with the technical steering committee? Like, you guys have like heated debates, or has it been pretty easy to come to agreements? Or
it's gotten heated from time to time. I think for sure that there's a lot of hot topics, and I think with the community, driving it just since June 1st, of 2020. So I think that's worth noting. It just started being formally driven by the community June 1st. And, in that time, I think there was a lot of community interests that developed over the course of 5 years, and so it's kind of an outpouring of community interests and desires. And so kind of balancing that is always a trick. Really, the thing is that everything that's brought up is always things everyone wants. And so us and those who are on the technical steering committee are the same. I mean, we want most all of the things that are requested as well. So it's always a trick just to kind of balance the input. But there's a lot of people that contribute to even outside the TSC. So certainly if there's something the TSC is not doing, it's open source. So, I mean, you contribute it. We've made a point to really merge a lot of pull requests that had come in, some that were pending for months, if not years in some cases. and try to get those in and get those out. And we've been on a much more common chord of pushing out patches and fixes.
That's so great. This is so interesting. We could talk about this, but I think you have slides for us, right? You're going to show us. What are you showing us?
Let's get into Angular, because obviously if you're listening to AngularAir, you have an interest in Angular. And likewise, you're talking to two guests here, at least myself and Alex, who have a shared love in Angular as well. So we have an equal love in Angular. I would say that for myself, it's worth noting that I would have never gotten into NativeScript, I don't think, if it weren't for Angular. So Angular is really just as much a common chord as JavaScript itself. So one topic I want to get into, and I don't know if, should I share the screen? Do I need to share the screen? There we go. So we're going to talk about something that Angular really shines through when you combine it with something like NativeScript. And I first want to step like 10,000. I want to go up 10,000 feet, and let's look at kind of just generally when we're talking about mobile. Mobile's always a hot topic in any development circle. And always, you know, it's nice to understand that iOS and Android, if you live in the United States and you've been anywhere on the East and West Coast, it's a nice metaphor to think of iOS and Android as different as the East and West Coast. You know, we're all the same people. We're all there for the same purpose, but the vibes and the styles are different. The approaches are different. And so it's really nice to think of iOS and Android like the difference between the East and West Coast. Specifically, when we look at both platforms, you know, if we want to develop for the platform directly, you know, there's a lot of basic similarities. The modal is one of the most like key basic elements. Like there's nothing more basic than a modal view. You know, obviously on the surface, they look the same, they behave the same. But the key why there are things like NativeScript and there's things like React Native and there's Ionic. And the reason these things exist is because beyond the surface, the code is where things really start to diverge. And the code is really what you really, if you love JavaScript, you love the fact that it creates a unified code base. You know, and to the best that you can, it's really nice to develop in one language, just because the context switching, as all engineers know, is the killer to delivering anything on time. So if we look at iOS Swift, to open a modal like this is the code that you would normally do to open something like that on that platform. Likewise, Android, usually dealing with Java or Kotlin, it's going to look something like this, but Android's even a bit more verbose because that's actually the rest of it there. So it's a lot of code to manage. And if you were having to develop for these platforms on a day-to-day basis, you might could tell your family to take a back seat because you might not be seeing them too often managing two code bases like this. So let's look at an example of doing just that with JavaScript alone. So just these couple lines of code is actually what you can achieve with NativeScript and alongside with Angular. So this really, in a nutshell, is what is really fantastic and a game changer with doing pure platform mobile development with JavaScript. And this is really just the essence of like the beauty of JavaScript on mobile, right? I mean, this transcends all kind of framework flavors. I mean, if you really like JavaScript, you want to do it on mobile, this is what JavaScript can enable for you.
That slide transcends.
Transcends.
Did Alex do that? Can you do it again?
Can I do the sound
I'm
effect?
sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, Nathan, but that was cool. I just want to see it one more time. Whoa.
So, you know, specifically what we're looking at here is Angular and NativeScript together. It's worth noting that NativeScript is just JavaScript at its base. It does work with React. It works with Svelte. It works with Vue. Any flavor you want to decorate on it, you can mix in with it. This particular example is Angular specifically. So for Angular developers usually used to having a component and maybe working with services and even Vue container refs, you know, this is an example of that particular flavor with NativeScript. That you could pass it a component, tell it you want to show that modal from a modal service. It's given to you from the actual Angular integration with NativeScript and open it.
So to be clear, on that example there, because you showed the verbose examples for Swift and Java, that show modal that exists on the modal service, does that modal service come from NativeScript?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So mobile service is an Angular injectable service that's provided by NativeScript Angular integration with NativeScript. All it is an injectable service that provides an API that you can pass some Angular specifics, like an Angular component and a view container ref.
So as an Angular developer, I write 3 lines of code, potentially 1 if I don't format my code like this, to open a modal to show my own custom component in a modal.
That's true. And what's really astounding to understand is that when you execute that code, it's actually executing this code on iOS and Android.
Because as an Angular developer, I can write 1 line of code and I can handle that kind of complexity.
I hope so. Yeah, I mean, this is really, I think, why these frameworks exist and why they continue to exist today. And it's just the beauty and simplicity of that. But the productivity of that, I mean, if you are actually a consultant and a professional service provider in software and you want to be able to deliver on time and you want to be able to get creative and not be kind of bogged down by some of these code differences when you're developing for mobile, this is where the beauty resides for sure. So let me get into something a little more interesting, because opening a modal is really boring. Like, I mean, it's probably the utmost boring topic you could talk about with mobile in general, and just maybe even on web. It's kind of a boring topic, opening modals. So let's get into something a little more interesting. So like, what if we want to open a view from the left side of the device? Also, what if we want to open that view and swing out from the left? What if we want to open a partial view from the bottom and we want to dynamically show some content in there? Another one, but we actually want to theme it dark, and then also have this ability to open another composited view on top of that, and yet another composite view on top of that to really get some dynamic view work in play. You could also open a view that has like a transparent hole through it. So we actually got a view, you could consider this a modal, but there's actually a transparent background behind it to get some really like nice user experience.
Just a quick question here. This is a real app, right?
This is a real app. So this is one that is developed with NativeScript and Angular, and we're going to talk just a little bit about how Angular actually allowed some of these dynamics to work. So this is just kind of a high-level view of kind of all the different dynamic views that are going on, from videos that are inlaid and multiple composited views to sequenced videos and time that then sequence into different UX flows, and a lot of layering and compositing of views going on here. Now, what's worth noting is that this app, because it was developed with NativeScript, the view layer and all the composite that's happening is actually dealing with the Swift and the Java code on those platforms, but it's doing it with one language, and that's JavaScript. So this particular approach is something that we at InStudio coined the Photoshop approach to view building. It's something pretty unique that is enabled by Angular with NativeScript. And it's actually become such a nice way to develop with both frameworks that there's been some desire and request to actually build it directly into core. So you could use it with all flavors, even outside of Angular. But it's really Angular that brought about the creative ability to do this. So if you've ever developed, if you've ever designed with Photoshop, you know Photoshop has layers, and we're looking at kind of a Photoshop layer view here. And you could kind of, a lot of designers start in Photoshop when you're developing something, whether it's on the web or mobile or whatever. You always start with some type of design. You might layer up your views and kind of get a sense of how you want everything laid out. So this is a look at layers in Photoshop. If we put this side by side to actual compositive view in NativeScript, we're actually looking at a container that houses a bunch of Angular components. And the Angular components are composited when you look at it against Photoshop in a reverse order. So let's fix that for a second. So in NativeScript, if we actually looked at a container like this, now, if you're not familiar with NativeScript, don't get too caught up in the tags here, but a grid layout you could think of like a div. Grid layout is really you could picture a div there, and all we have is just some Angular components that are composited on top of each other. The page router outlet is much like you would be familiar with in Angular, the router outlet. That's just one that in particular deals with page navigation on mobile. So the visual z-index goes down. So every Angular component that's here, this would be on the top, this would then be below it, below it, below it. And if we were to look at that in Photoshop, as all designers know, it goes the opposite direction because you design on top and the layers you stack on top. So just to match these up, we'll flip it upside down, and we're going to look at this and exactly how it matches up to each component. So you could actually design in Photoshop exactly how you want your views and your Angular components to be composited and how you want them to interact visually on screen. And this is really a pretty effective way to design and develop, but it's also a really effective way to get creative with a lot of really dynamic view work on mobile. So let's take a look at an example. So in this particular case here, this opens up a view. That view, if we looked at it side by side, we can actually see how these layers match up and how they're composited. So if we look at this, that's actually a shade cover that has intelligence on all the other view compositing layers. So when a view composite comes up and that view composite wants to show a shade behind it, it can activate this Angular component to actually shade the back. This is very similar to obviously how you work in Angular material. And if there's a shade that's going to come in a div in the DOM and it's going to show when a modal appears, it's the same kind of interaction. We're kind of developing that out in a really kind of intelligent system with view compositing in kind of a holistic dynamic way. So this is the pop-up view that would activate. Each of these Angular components that are on the screen are actually completely inactive. So they're ng templates. They actually have no effect on performance. They're not involved in the rendering engine at the time until they're actually activated and brought into the UX spectrum to be used. The page router outlet is the very back. So what's neat about this approach is that the page router outlet, if you're familiar with building Angular components, the router outlet in what you develop with your routing is kind of the heart of your application, right? Like that contains all your routing, your pages. You do most of your interaction with the app at that layer. But often, because you want to deal with things kind of and dismiss them and maybe get into one view and dismiss that, that's where kind of modals come into view. And so these layers act as kind of a really dynamic way to get creative with modals, because modals on the surface are super boring. Like I mentioned, they kind of have two general traits. You can open them partially or you can open them full screen. And on mobile devices, generally out of the box, that's all you get. But you really want to be able to do creative things with those views. So this is really what the Angular component and layering strategy allows you to do.
And custom, right? Because you can now have the ability to customize the modal dialogues fully and just have them look how you want them.
So this is obviously really terrifying right here, but it's also really fitting for October and the Halloween holiday that's approaching. But this is an example of several layers at play. There's actually a layer that is composited for full screen animation of the coins. There's also sugar drops that fly. Those are composited too on a layer. And all this is kind of an intelligent system that interacts with each other, of course, using cross-component communication and kind of a general event bus system. So here's another example. This is the shade cover, and then this is the pop-up view. Now, what's interesting about this cross section is that from the previous view, that's actually the exact same Angular component. So we were actually able to reuse the same Angular component to show a view with a whole bunch of different dynamic attributes. In this case, there's a hole poked through it. It's transparent, and we can actually do really any type of visual inside of that container, but yet use the same methodology to interact with it. Open it in a consistent way on both iOS and Android. It invoke pure platform behavior to do that, but yet have this really nice creative control to create things dynamically on the fly. So all of this setup, and I'm going to show just a slight example of it in a moment, but it's really Angular's ability to create components on the fly with component factory resolver and inserting things in an ng container that kind of enables this like creative ability to do all this. So again, same deal. The back of this cross section would be the page router outlet. That's the app that most users interact with for the majority of the app, and then all these dynamic things can come in play to kind of really increase the user experience. So here's a more even dynamic example than that, where down here, this is a composited layer for the audio fob itself. This is just to deal with audio in the app. Again, page router outlet on the back. And then in this case, we've got a pop-up view that comes up, and then a modal overlay. And then we can also open an audio player over top of that. So a lot of rich interaction going on here. You can interact with the audio player at any time because it's composited on top of everything. Modal overlays can actually come up full screen over top of existing pop-up views. So you have this ability to kind of really fluidly deal with data in the app, whether it's something purely for visual or teaching, or whether it's actually something that's, you know, part of the business logic of the app. So if we kind of take all of that visual and we break it down to code, this is actually how simple you can distill all of that dynamic behavior by engaging with, again, yet another great thing about the Angular ecosystem, in that it's rich ecosystem of libraries like NGRX. So NGRX really enables a nice way you can deal with data, but also it's a nice way to deal with state in views. So we actually use NGRX often in apps to deal with state in UX layers. So this is an example of opening any view in that example I was showing with NGRX. We're saying, hey, pop-up actions open, pass it a component type, and it's going to know what layer to activate, and it will take that component, use the factory resolver to open it, which I'll show an example of that in a moment. This is just an example of how to close it. So this right here on the surface is what you use as a developer on a day-to-day basis across your entire team to interact with dynamics like we just saw. And those dynamics are really, I'd say they almost look complex on the surface, but this is how simple it is to interact with from a development scope. And this is really where the ability to deliver, the ability to move and pivot and do things on the fly per management demands, this is really what enables that to be done really nice and fluidly, because you really create a nice system to work in like this. This is an example of the pop-up component itself and what happens kind of under the hood. And under the hood, of course, this is Angular. So we've got just a subscription to the state of that pop-up, and that component type comes in, and we use Angular's resolver to create that component on the fly. It inserts that component into the view. The behavior of all those layers can be whatever you want them to be. Like I was mentioning at the beginning, whether you want it to fly out from the left, fly out from the right, whether you want it to spin and swizzle and jump and bounce when it comes in, you can really get super creative. But Angular under the hood allows you to do the technical stuff necessary to keep the app performant, because dynamic components on the fly is really like where you can keep a lot of stuff off of the visual stack initially. And so your rendering engine is really fast, and then you only create what you need at the moment you need it. This is that component factory resolver. This is actually creating component in the slot. And then that's where you get the opportunity to get creative with animation control. But this is kind of an example of the view of that. So the counterpart to the underhood wiring is, as I mentioned, an ng container. The ng container has a content, the contents of viewchild, that we read as a view container ref, and then that's what we actually attach the dynamic component to. So NGRX is driving the whole system. We can, as developers, create components on the fly for anything that the team wants to be able to show and interact with, and then we can create them on the fly using Angular's viewchild ng container setup.
And to be clear, we're talking about with a view container ref and throwing templates inside the container. That is, you're talking about that from the context of popping modals solely and still using the router to handle that. You're not looking at managing the routes.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Manually,
So you can do routes inside of modals as well. In this case, at least in this particular app, there was no request to do kind of routing inside of that. But if you wanted to embed routes inside of that, you could do that in a similar way with named routes and router outlets like you would generally with what you're familiar with Angular. It's worth noting that Angular 11, which I think is in some beta runs, or is it in RC?
I think it's still pre-beta. It's been released under a next tag on NPM, so it's not ready and baked. But
so yeah, we are playing with Angular 11 and actually rewriting from scratch the entire Angular integration for NativeScript. The reason we decided to do this is that the Angular integration with NativeScript was written right when Angular 2 came out. You know, and when modern Angular was established, that integration was being written during that time. So there's a lot of things in that integration that are showing their age a little bit. You know, it's been around for what, four years now, maybe. And now with Ivy and with Angular 11 and how much better things have gotten there's really a lot of nice things you can take advantage of now that you just couldn't maybe 4 years ago in the way the integration worked. And so we're taking a fresh take at the whole Angular integration with NativeScript and working with a contributor right now to rewrite that from scratch. So Angular 11 will be a top to bottom rewrite for NativeScript, and we're going to try to have it done and aligned with the same time Angular 11 becomes available, hopefully. So
that brings up an interesting question. So with restructuring the compatibility between NativeScript and Angular with version 11, can you touch on the strategy for backwards compatibility if there is one?
Yeah, so backwards compatibility right now, we're planning the API to be exactly the same. So yeah, the API, we don't plan to change. It'll really just be a drop-in replacement with an incredibly better engine.
Encapsulation for the win.
That's the goal. Now, will there be an API or two that may change? Maybe. I mean, one thing in particular that we already know from Angular 11 and just Ivy in general is that you can deal with components a lot more one-to-one. Because you can create them without as much boilerplate as you had to in the past. You know, I think you can import the component dynamically. You don't even have to perhaps resolve it in the same way. But so there's some really nice improvements in what you can do there. So like that modal service that we saw where it passes the component in, there's probably even a more concise API you could get that's actually even more pure Angular and could even avoid a service in and of itself. So there's some potential there, but we'd probably try to keep things like that around so you could still use it. It would still work in an app if you dropped it in, but you could start to do it in different ways that maybe are more powerful, maybe more simpler, that sort of thing. Outside of kind of the view.
By the way, Nathan, we have a lot of questions waiting when you.
Oh, sure.
We can do it at the end if you want, or I was saving them. We had a whole bunch of questions come in all at the end, or all at the same time.
This is actually the end slide here, so we could go to questions here. That's kind of what we really wanted to show with Angular and NativeScript combined. You know, it for Angular developers that are used to working with ViewChild or ng container, and just the development stack does feel pretty natural. To Angular developers, because again, you know, myself was a long-time Angular developer before NativeScript ever came along, and I was really looking for something that was natural for Angular. So it really was Angular that got me into the scope of things for sure.
I have one quick question. I'm going to jump in front of the viewers who are asking questions on YouTube. So a lot of what made things pop with the demo of the different screens you were showing are the animations. Can you touch on a little bit of how those are implemented, whether or not it's using Angular's animation library or if it's something specific to NativeScript and whether or not
I was going to ask the same question. Mike jumped in front of me, and I was going to jump in front of them. And also, that is actually one of the comments that we got. So that's next level. Who did you do that, or did Alex do that?
Oh, hold on. Before that, I'm not talking about the animation of the slide. I'm talking about the animations in the application.
Yeah, that too. Both.
Let me go
it's
back.
all cool.
Let me go back to that. Right here is
yes.
So
yeah.
That's a great question. So there is an animation module inside NativeScript that uses the same animation stack that you're used to as an Angular developer, using the decorations with the animation. So you have that option. The thing that's sort of fascinating about NativeScript in a sense is that, you do have a very wide world open to you with NativeScript. It's hard to not stress that enough. And so what that means is that you really do have kind of a lot of directions you could go. And so it kind of all boils down to kind of like best practices. When I think about, and Bonnie was speaking to this in the beginning prior to the show, Angular is such a broad framework in and of itself. There's a lot of different angles you can go with Angular because it's a very liberating framework to work in. I mean, it provides opportunities to do all sorts of things creatively in different ways. Some of those ways maybe are not as good as others, and that's where some experience and I think just best practices come into play. And Angular has a wonderful best practices guide that I think, if you do follow that, it will lead you to good results. NativeScript is kind of similar in that sense. And we actually do want to write a best practice guide to working with it because just like Angular, there are good ways to do things. There can be really poor ways to do things that can lead you to poor results. And I think when it comes to animation, it depends ultimately on what control you want. So Angular, if you want to rely on Angular's life cycle purely for animation control, use it. That is a great practice. If you want to have a really fine-grained control over the animation, you might want to actually tap into some of the power of NativeScript there, because NativeScript does enable pure animations on the platform. So what that means is things like CA animation, which is a really rich Quartz graphics kind of animation hook in iOS. Android has its animator, which is pretty amazing to work with too in terms of like spring and bounce dynamics. So you kind of have these things at your fingertips. And I'd say one of the hardest decisions always is well, what should I use right now for this case? And always what I like to recommend to people is use what feels natural. And so if Angular animations feel natural to wire in, use that. If you're familiar with NativeScript at all and you're familiar with its animation APIs, maybe you're more comfortable using those. And so you can use those. And that's kind of the beauty of the combination, is that you can generally use what feels natural to you to use. Beyond that, usually in real production environments and day-to-day work, you are often thinking about performance a lot. You think about performance, you think about control, you think about scenarios and edge cases. And I think as anyone knows who's done really big web apps and animations, there's always like little edge cases. Edge cases can come up through glitches maybe. It could be a navigation thing. Maybe there's a case with an animation that you want to actually cancel when something happens. And so mobile is really, I would say, it's really particular on user interaction, because the user's thumb's on it all the time. So you never know what the user's going to do on a mobile device because their thumb is trigger happy. Certainly people are trigger happy with a mouse on the desktop, but it's uniquely different because you have gestures involved too. So people are swiping, they're moving, they're maybe putting it in their pocket, they could be just going monkey crazy on the device. And so for that reason, like, it's really nice when you're talking about animation to be like really precise. You want to know when an animation is queued up. You want to know at what point maybe where it's at. You want to know how to cancel that. You want to have broad animation control over all those scenarios, because perhaps you're landing them in an intro sequence that's animating, but there's a navigation point the user can then ditch out of that. And so you want to be sure that you have like really nice control to say, okay, you know what, the user decided they don't want to see that, so let's cut that off and let's allow them to go over here. And then further, you want to allow them to do it in the most performant way possible. So because animation, even with any API, is going to take some cycles to engage with. You know, the CPU on the computer is engaging when it's doing animations and that sort of thing. And so the mobile device, just inherently with the way mobile and doing performant mobile apps, is that you really want to have nice control over everything the CPU is touching. And so animation is definitely one of those. So
yeah, and animation is actually one of those things that you can do in many different ways. In case you have a certain need for JavaScript animation, you can do that. There's many different layers of animation. You can do JavaScript animations. Request animation frame is an API that's available. So those are familiar with the web animations will use that. Angular animations is available, and CSS animations. Now, like Nathan was saying, there's CPU bound animations and there's GPU bound animations, and you have both options when you're using NativeScript animations.
Yeah, like a good example actually is this particular view here, which actually has animation that's coming up continuously over user interaction. So you're talking about a continuously hit animation that's flying up over the ability to user to interact, because when they type in a chat, it's very much like Periscope in that sense. You can chat, you're actually interacting with the device, you need that to be fluid, but you also want your animation to be fluid. And so you really want those threads to be distinct. And Angular will give you that through the APIs with the integrations as well. But it really just comes down to, do you have enough fine-grained control in that API to give you what you want for that scenario? That's like kind of like the edge cases that I'm talking about. And they're the ones that are probably harder to know up front. You can't really predict those in all cases. Generally that comes out in QA testing when you're kind of going through it and you find that, oh, well, when the user's doing this, we kind of want to control it this way. It's hard to preconceive those things. But yeah, that's where you kind of want to have a good understanding of best practice in that, and what you have available to you at your fingertips. And so I think that's where knowing Angular Animations API and also knowing NativeScript's Animation API can really enjoin each other, because they complement each other.
That's something that I've often wondered about, because I know that gestures on the iPhone are significantly different than gestures or patterns on Android. So I didn't know how hard that would be to address, or maybe the NativeScript API lends a hand towards this is what you should use, versus, because I feel like if you design something for both phones without taking into consideration common patterns or gestures used by that particular brand, that maybe you'd be missing something.
You hit on a great question.
Have you found that
this is really what core NativeScript is about. So NativeScript core is a JavaScript library. It's a JavaScript library that actually NativeScript doesn't need on the surface, believe it or not. NativeScript is just a runtime that basically allows JavaScript to access the platform as is. Now, what core does is it basically creates a JavaScript library that allows you to do what you're talking about from a single API. So it's basically condensing both platforms to one, and it's essentially doing kind of that cross-platform work for you. So when you talk about accessing something like gestures, there's a gesture event in NativeScript core that you can wire up to any view. That view could be an Android view.view. If you're talking about the actual Java package for the Android view, it could be that. It can also be the UI view on iOS, but it's the same event in NativeScript core. So gesture events, touch, swipe, double tap, things like that. It's a single event. Also what you're used to in Hammer.js, if you've used it on the web, it's doing effectively kind of that same thing. It's giving you a single API. It matches that gesture no matter where you run it. So you never have to think about the platform differences with NativeScript core. That's what NativeScript core is really all about.
So if you think of that modal dialog that we started out with, as an example, the modal dialog is completely different in Android and iOS, the way it behaves, the way it's presented, and the code for that. And there's one single API that NativeScript core library, you can think of it as maybe the jQuery of the native
Okay.
world. You can think of it that way. It kind of flattens that out for you. So you call one API and then it just does it for you, whatever is required.
Okay, so the simplicity on using the native script end is not reflective of what it's outputting. It's very much for each platform.
Okay,
doing
listen,
something
y'all.
different.
This is very interesting, but I have to speak up because we have questions. All these people in the chat are waiting so patiently, and it's getting close to the top of the hour. And then Mike jumped in, and then Alyssa jumped in, and we have to answer these questions. Luckily, though, we have community office hours right after this, and we have Nathan and Alex who are coming with us over to the community hangout. So you guys can all come, but can we just run through, because some of these are really quick questions.
Shoot.
Can we do it?
Do it.
Justin's in the chat.
Is that Justin Schwarzenberger in the chat? Because I forgot to say, hey, how's it going, y'all? I didn't say hey. Okay. I know Justin. Okay, Nathan, is this app that you showed us in the demo on production? And if so, what's it called?
It's called Sweet. It's literally called Sweet.
All right. And here's a really good question also. Do we have a component library of pre-built components with NativeScript? And if so, where is it?
That's a great question. So there's some basic components that Core provides. It's basically the basic UI components that most expect to use on iOS and Android. Things like date picker. There's even a web view available in there. The text field, the button, the label, things like that. The community around NativeScript has provided numerous libraries on all sorts of things, one of which is material. So there's a contributor, Martin Guyon, who has provided UI material for NativeScript. That one is generally, I'd say, pretty well flushed out with the UI components. I think there are still a few on his to-do list to add to that. But that's a well-known one that's used pretty often. Alex, on component libraries, I'm trying to think of one that might be as flushed out as UI material.
The entire set of libraries, maybe not, but there are quite a few really good packages on NPM available as plugins for NativeScript that do that. For example, there's a nice charting library that one of the TSC members is working on?
Yeah, actually, it's worth noting Progress, when they were hosting NativeScript, had developed a UI Pro suite. This UI Pro suite was pretty advanced for UI components, but it was also private source. And it's actually still private source today, and it probably will never be public source. And so for that reason, there has been some push and desire for the community to develop open source alternatives, because really everyone around NativeScript, obviously loves open source and likes to contribute. So the UI Pro Suite does work with NativeScript 7. We have been able to update those for NativeScript 7, but at the same time, we are exploring some alternatives. And so there are 2 charting alternatives already that have popped up. I think there's even an alternative to that UI Pro Suite RAD list view. So yeah, hopefully that answers the question.
Wait, yes, I think so. And we have a couple more questions, but we're running out of time. I know Mike has a question, and it's the top of the hour. So I just want to remind everybody, after this, we're going to do a community hangout after this. So if you didn't get your question answered, go over there, and they will be with us answering more questions. But I think we have time for one more, and then we'll wrap it up.
So you've done a really good job selling like the business case of, all right, one single code base to be able to manage both mobile applications on iOS and Android, as well as the user experience to get a native application from the companies providing applications. But we're developers. So what is our experience like in terms of debugging?
Yeah, so great question. This has long been a gripe, I would say, with the NativeScript community in general. There is a Chrome DevTools debugger. You can debug the code. You can also get into the inspector. But it's always an area where improvement could be had. I mean, We are very effective with the Chrome debugger in debugging apps, and it works really well. If you have the NativeScript CLI installed and you run your app with debug, so there's NS run iOS, NS run Android. You can also do NS debug iOS or NS debug Android. When you use debug, that's actually going to give you a URL in the console, and that URL is a DevTools link. You can just open in Chrome and just debug like you'd be used to. Breakpoint, you can peruse the whole app.
Even if it's running on an actual device that you have hooked up to your machine, you can still walk through that and debug and step through the code.
That's true. So breakpoints are fully engaged, and it's super effective. I mean, it's effective enough for us that we're really productive with it, like those who use it all the time. It's not to say you could always improve that, though, more. I mean, I'd say that I think all involved in NativeScript would love to see better, even debug tools beyond that. Perhaps there's a better inspector on the visual side, to get in and inspect nodes. And there was an element inspector there in the Chrome debug tools that was pretty decent, but honestly, I think it left a lot to be desired. So I really think the actual element inspector could be improved quite a bit, where you could really see your kind of child structure there and be able to investigate.
But you can pop open those projects in Xcode if you so desire and see the hierarchy, the visual hierarchy of the UI elements that get built.
That's true. Alex, do you have a video?
I don't have that handy right now. No,
you should do a video on that sometime for sure.
I will definitely do it.
Hey, but as far as I'm concerned, you told me I could basically get console logs. If I can get console logs, I can figure it.
I mean, console logs are always effective, yeah. But honestly, the Chrome debugger is really nice. It really is. It's an extremely effective tool.
So speaking of console logs, there's a whole suite of different global objects that web developers are used to. Console, alert, prompt, confirm, things like that, right? And those are all globally available in NativeScript. So people can just use those out of the box.
So with something like prompt, which is basically asking the user for input, does that pop a native control then to the user to be able to provide input and gather input?
It does, and it does a native dialogue in iOS style, and it does a native dialogue in Android with Android style.
I dig it.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's another pinning question. I don't want to take someone's question.
There's lots more pinning questions. And Mike Robshin said thank you for pushing his question up there because we were running out of time.
It too.
Yeah. Because it was a really good question, and there's more really good questions too. Do you guys want to do quick picks? Did you want to get anything else, Nathan, before we wrap it up? We got about
just one more thing that people often really ask me about. I get this question a lot. Is yes, you can do different platforms, right? iOS and Android, but how do you do shared code with web? For example, if you have a web project,
yay! I was wondering that.
Right? Yeah. And maybe even Kendo UI components in there, throw some in there, and then and then you have your iOS and your Android, and all of them sharing the same code.
I just assumed that you would have a different app. Like this is your NativeScript app for mobile. This is your web app. Is that not true? Is that not what's happening?
You can certainly do that, but you can also share a lot of that code. So a lot of the code that you see here, even the code that's on the screen right at this moment, this code, it looks like it can be shared because it's all Angular code. So you can put this into a library using something called NX workspaces and be able to share this code in your web projects and in your NativeScript projects.
Yeah, so what's nice, I think, about what NX does in the mentality and thinking about it is probably more to what is effective for code sharing in general, which is really the line is from your deployment target. So, when Alyssa, when you said you assume you have a NativeScript app and you have a web app, you might have these thin shells that deploy out to, maybe you deploy it to Amazon or Firebase for web and you deploy that out. But the actual engine, the heart of that code, can be the same app. So you might have a different deployment target, but the heart of it is actually the same.
All right. That was awesome.
Bonnie, chat's making fun of you for being such a time manager.
I know. Well, I feel bad because we also have people waiting in the Hangouts already, I think. So I'm trying to do this. And Justin's so good at this, you guys. I'm just used to being a panelist. I don't have any responsibility.
We miss you, Justin, for sure. Hopefully you're all right.
Come back, Justin.
I felt really bad when they said we missed the hey. And I was like, oh, yeah, that is really good. I should have done that. See? I'm just not. It's big shoes to fill, you guys.
Bonnie, you're doing
You're doing
awesome.
a great job.
Thank you so much. Okay, so does anybody have picks? I mean, you want to do picks? Raise your hand if you have picks. Anybody? Okay. Let's start at the top. Go ahead. I'm going to turn off the screen share. I think you're done sharing your screen, right, Nathan? Okay. Now the order just messed up. Okay. Nathan, what's your pick?
My pick would be Vue 3 just came out, by the way, which is interesting on AngularAir. But Igor, who does Vue, also has done the Vue 3 integration with NativeScript as well. So certainly that's something to check out if you're interested in front-end frameworks in general. Also, I might mention Bram Borave, who I think you guys just had on last week.
He was on the show last week, Beeman.
With the Pang stack, is that what it is?
Yes.
If you haven't gotten into the Pang stack yet, it's very, very cool. A very nice stack. So yeah, definitely check out Bram and maybe last week's AngularAir episode if you missed it.
Those are very, very good picks. Alex?
So what are picks exactly? Because
anything cool that you want to share with the community. It could be dev related. It could be it could be a book, anything.
Sure. Okay, so I deploy my website, nativescripting.com, using Netlify, and it's built in Gatsby. And I'm just blown away by how easy it is these days to just push a button. It commits my code to GitHub. Netlify grabs it, picks it up, builds it, and my site is live. I just love that. And it's so simple.
That's amazing. Netlify. I've heard people talking about it, but I haven't actually checked it out. Now I think I want to.
Love it. It's fantastic.
Alyssa, what's your pick?
DevReach. So it's the first conference that I've ever organized. I'm personally organizing the Angular Relay at DevReach this year. It is a free online conference, and we're doing something really unique with the format. So instead of just having speakers that come up and give talks, I thought it'd be really fun to have one repo that we pass from speaker to speaker and they add things to. And then I'll also be doing some personal interviews to get to know some really popular names in the community, but on a personal level instead of a coding level. So I will share the link in the chat, but it's free. Come join us. It's in about 3 weeks. So
that's so great. Mike, do you have a pick?
I do. I have two. One is The Boys on.
It's such a good story, but I had to stop watching. I can't do it. The gore.
Is it on Netflix?
It's rather gorish and vulgar, but
is it Hulu really or Netflix? I get
Prime. It's Amazon Prime.
Yeah. Prime. Yeah, neither. Okay.
It's so good. I really enjoy it. Actually, I may sneak out all of
I haven't seen
to watch today's episode.
I haven't seen season 2 yet. Is that good? As good as the first season?
No spoilers now.
It's good. It's good. I like it. So that's my first pick. My other one is personal. As of about a month ago, we haven't had a few episodes. I missed last week's episode, but I have joined Hero Devs as a partner there and have really enjoyed that. So
awesome.
Yay.
Congrats to Hero Devs. If you haven't checked out Scully, got to check out Scully. I've used it recently. I love it, Mike. It's fantastic.
It's funny you should say that because you know who's waiting for us right now in the community hangout?
Sonder.
Oh, tell them
Saunders there. Yeah. Okay. So, which brings us to my pick, which is community office hours. So, if you want to join us, go to angularnation.net. It's free. You just need to put in your email address, and then I'm going to check to make sure that everyone who's waiting has been approved to get in. And then go look at the events and join us. And then you can come on camera if you want to and ask us questions and talk to us, so you don't have to ask questions in the chat anymore. So yeah, that's it. Okay, join us back next time. Justin will be back. This was just a one-time thing. Don't worry. And thank you so much, Alyssa,
Yes,
Mike,
Alex.
Nathan, and Alex. This was awesome. And thank
Thanks,
you to
Bonnie.
all the people in the chat. These were great questions.
Thanks so much for having us.
Great questions.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.